Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Change Leaders Monthly Series, where we have experts from key areas of institutions of higher ed and talking about topics that we all need to grow. My name is Dr. Drum McNaught, and I'm the CEO of the Change Leader, and it's my pleasure to have a fabulous guest with us today, Jim Bouse. A little bit more about Jim, just a couple of housekeeping notes. One thing that we talk about is holistic approaches to higher ed. And the American Quality Foundation, in conjunction with Ernst & Young, published a study a couple of years back in which they looked at 945 management practices over 580 organizations in US, Japan, and Canada. And they used some best practices metrics of market performance, operations, and financial performance. They found three things that were ubiquitous across wherever an organization was. That these were the things that had an impact on the organization in those three metrics. Strategic planning with good implementation practices, business process improvement if it's focused on the customer, and lastly, the continuous broadening of the breadth and depth of leadership and management practices. Now, today we're really going to take a look at that first one very in depth, that strategic planning with good implementation practices, really focused on strategic enrollment management. Some of the things that we preach at TCL are holistic thinking that includes that planning, the positioning, and implementation, which is focused on outcomes, the alignment of strategy, structures, and process, and finally, the attunement of people to a shared vision. Just one couple of housekeeping notes. I'll be posting the slides up on the website after the presentation. Everybody's phone is muted, so if you have a question, please type it into the chat box or via the question box. And lastly, if you stick around to the end, we've got a special gift for everybody. So today we're very fortunate to have Jim Bouse, who is the Director of Enrollment Management Technology and Associate Registrar for Technology at the University of Oregon. Jim serves on the Student Services and Enrollment Management Leadership Team and directs the staff that manages the technology infrastructure supporting enrollment management, including ECM, CRM, and electronics records systems. Jim's always on the lookout for new and interesting ways to utilize technology to further the goals of enrollment management. I've really been privileged to get to know Jim a bit as we've been preparing for this. He's one of those folks who lives to give to his fellow man. You know, he's the immediate past president of AACRAO, the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers. He's done a tremendous amount of work for them, the Pacific Association for Collegiate Registrars and Admission Officers, and the Oregon Association, same thing. Multiple presentations, webinars, workshops, both at the regional and the national level conference. He's also an outdoor enthusiast, backpacking with his wife and two daughters, and what a better place to do that in Oregon. So Jim, welcome. Thank you very much for agreeing to present today. Today we're going to talk about how to attract more of the right students. So Jim, if you would, take it away.
Thanks, Drum. And good morning or good afternoon all, depending on where you're located. So Drum, you really gave me a nice introduction there. One thing I always look at in strategic enrollment management and just almost anything you do, it's setting those expectations. So sometimes I often look at expectations can be resentments and waiting for some folks. So properly setting those expectations becomes very important with your own staff, with any kind of project you're doing. So let's jump in here. You can look at some of these things and see if you can recognize yourself or your institution in here. We can just look at some of these. Enrollments are down or trending down. A lot of these we'll get into later, look at larger overarching demographic trends, either nationally and globally. Revenues not meeting current expenses. Borrowing from an endowment, or there is no endowment for your institution, or if you've crossed over kind of an inflection point where you're tapping into basically the endowment / savings type of thing, and are you still putting more into that and you're taking out? you have an institutional strategic plan? Or are you following it? Has it been updated? Is it current? Is it really reflecting a current environment that we're operating in? No academic strategic plan, or it's not in line with the institution's strategic plan. Faculty actions, how are they related to the current environment? Are faculty aware of and understand the environment that your institution has to deal with? That's where we look at the last bullet point. Do they have a greater say in everything or balk at necessary changes? For instance, like, when is the last time you've actually had the institutional guidance or wherewithal to sit down and do a review of different academic programs? How many majors have you had? Do you have majors and programs that are kind of dwindling and you're still staffing something that is maybe supporting only 2 or 3 majors that are graduating each year?
Jim, I
so
just,
the new
I
normal.
just thought, Jim,
Yeah,
I
John,
just saw something today that a study came out. 25% of all private universities are running a deficit at this point, and they have been for the last 2 years. I mean, that to me is amazing. I've never seen anything like this in higher ed before.
Yeah, and obviously that's where we get into really looking at sustainability and not so much the environmental piece of that, but your actual business. So yes, you're a higher ed institution, but you're also a business that needs to hire people, keep the lights on, being able to deliver the services that customers/students are expecting when they come to you, and can you still deliver that value? And beyond that, are you reaching that inflection point, or can you see it far enough ahead of time, realizing I need to make some course corrections to not get to that point where it becomes a kind of self-defeating, self-fulfilling prophecy in a negative way, where students are going to look at that and say, is that institution going to be around enough so when I have my degree and the value that's connoted with that degree and what you receive as an education, oftentimes will be not just now, but who is that institution going to be in 10 years, 20 years from now when people look back and say, where'd you go to school?
Exactly. So I think we're at a new normal, aren't we?
Yeah, there are a lot of things changing, and a lot of things we used to take for granted aren't just going to be there. We need to be smarter and more thoughtful and more intentional about the actions and what we do and how we look ahead. So, number of traditional college-age students decreasing. And this isn't the case in all states, but if we're just looking at the United States, and we're looking at different states, there's plenty of data out there. Witchy and others have produced the data on looking at demographic trends. I'm sure just about everybody on the webinar here have seen some of the same data on looking at what are the projections from now to 2020 to 2030 and out as far as where are we with high school graduates. So if you're looking for traditional college-age students, first-time, full-time freshmen, but then we'll also touch on things like where are some different markets you can get with adult learners, transfer students. But traditional college-age students, that's decreasing or is flat, and in some places decreasing, and people are sort of fighting over that same sort of pie, especially if you don't have a national reach, when you're maybe more regional or not even regional, but kind of more city-specific and very local. Obviously, you have some places like Texas that is still looking at an upswing. A lot of that is growth in population, either moving people between different states or just simply the growth in population. But even that population then you look at is changing. So you'll have the amount of different ethnicities in different categories, what types of students you're looking at, what their preferences are, what some of their influences and factors differ between all those populations. So tailoring of what you do to what's coming in the future is incredibly important, especially in the light of the data you were mentioning, Drum, on just people tapping into or running out of deficit or possibly tapping into endowments that won't continue forever. So the next bullet here, looking at institutions looking alike, this is where we're going to get into competitive advantages, assessments. You can't just be the same thing. So that's going to be where we'll look into things like distinctive competencies and advantages. 70% of all current students fall into the non-traditional category. So these are potential students, and also current students that are out there in all varieties of programs across the United States and all methods of public, private, for-profit, nonprofit, and who is out there delivering some form of education to people that are consuming it as students. This has been out there and a lot. Some of this could be, and I'll touch on this, could be by sort of the divisiveness of what's currently happening across our nation with the political factors that are occurring, which camp people are in, if they think, is education actually delivering the value for what we're putting into it, particularly in the public arena also, and private, as you get into people looking at state-funded, state-located, state-assisted, and that goes down and the tuition increases. The parents are rightfully looking at, if we're going to help a student or even an adult student that's putting their own money into this, and you're looking at what kind of loan and debt you're going to incur, what am I getting? What's my return on investment that I'm putting into this? And can I visualize what I will be doing for a job out there in the open market after I graduate? The worst thing in this, of course, is students that don't retain, don't succeed, and don't graduate from anywhere, even if they transfer or move to somewhere else. The worst of all outcomes are students that go into higher ed or go into any kind of educational program, aren't successful, but they've engendered some form of student debt, and they have nothing as far as that piece of paper, that actual accredited degree to show for it. There's sort of that lost out there with the debt that they've got to pay back. This, you can kind of read through this. It's just a quick, are you doing things, and I'll just give you my take on some of this traditional age things. People probably, have been in the higher ed enrollment management side of the house, particularly if you're looking at admissions recruiting. A lot of this has always been about, are you being just expanding the size of the funnel at the top? So let's say your goal, if you have a goal and you're looking at I want 1,000 students at the bottom that are actually going to this next fall or this next term or whoever's going to enroll in whatever period. I want 1,000 students. That's what I'm looking for, that are going to start matriculating and start taking education and classes with us and courses and engage with our institution. So how am I going to get that? Do I just keep expanding the size of that funnel and getting more and more names out there and just doing this sort of spray and pray? Or how intentional are you about that? And ideally, I know this isn't going to happen, but if you're an institution that's concerned or within the U.S. News and World Report rankings on selectivity of institutions, there are all kinds of games that could potentially be played there as far as increasing the number of applicants, which part do you actually select, and how selective you get. But I always kind of challenge that with saying, you want a gigantic funnel on the top, or if you could, and you got really intelligent about who are the students that you really want. Do you know that? And can you say who they are? And if you could, would you just take the 1,000 names you're desiring, and if somebody could hand those to you and say, go create a relationship with these 1,000, would you want to turn that funnel into a pipe that you just reach out to those folks, and then those are the folks that can end up on your campus or within your programs? So I don't think that blue sky, pie in the sky kind of view you're going to get from that giant expansive funnel on the top straight to a pipe. But somewhere in there, you need to get smarter about decreasing that and figuring out who are the students that you need to go after that are going to be the most successful and that you're going to get to your institution.
Yeah. So this is the typical process that we've done for traditional age students. We've also got the same thing here for transfer students.
Mm-hmm.
And I think folks can read this as well. This is typical. Anything jump out at you on this, Jim?
Well, again, a lot of this is really understanding. This is where we're going to get a little bit on the strategic planning side of both a strategic plan at the institution level and at your enrollment management area, that level too, of who are you? What is your institution? I mean, you have to have that understanding of self. And then what are you trying to become? Are you trying to become something different, or Are you true to who you see yourself as an institution or an entity? And then who are the students that you want there? So, and then, because that's going to be, and where are they? Otherwise, you can go out to an open house on campuses, et cetera. But students are going to really, you always have to look at that from the perspective of every student, and rightfully so, should be selfish to a degree that they're going to be asking that question, what's in it for me? Are you the right place for me? Am I going to achieve the best Jim Bouse possible and into my future at your institution?
Mm-hmm. That makes perfect sense. So we've got the typical for, adult students, and again, it's more of the same. It's going out and buying people's names, et cetera, like that, which we all know has worked in the past to some limited extent, but it really doesn't now. So I think what you're saying, Jim, is stop these craziness.
Well, at least I'll get into kind of looking at building that foundation and going forward into that. But on the last slide, the very first thing there, you had the example of putting up a billboard on a highway. And somebody can see that and might just think, and that tactical level sort of thing is, can we just do this and increase a certain amount of students that are going to enroll, matriculate at our school? But that's that tactical level. It's very seductive, and we all want to, like, can we just find that silver bullet, that one thing that's, let's just do this, and that's going to make the difference. But evaluating that, there's all kinds of things you need to do. Like you said, you need to really back up the truck and build that foundation to get to that tactical piece, to even understand things like, where's the demographic population that's going to be most specific? Are you putting, if you do end up at a point where you tactically choose to put a billboard up somewhere, is it on the right highway? Who are the people that travel on that highway? Are they coming from an area that's composed of that demographic, ethnographic, demographic, socioeconomic background that you're looking at? So are the people driving by going to be the right people that you're even hoping to attract?
And I think in some ways, highway is a metaphor, because you've also got so many different channels online through Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. It could be the information superhighway you're talking about.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of channels out there, and you just have to understand what are the appropriate channels for what you're trying to achieve.
Exactly.
So yeah, just going to stop that, and let's just, before we just plunge in, take that time to think and consider where we're going, what we're trying to achieve, and are we going about it in the right way, in the right direction. So let's take a look at strategic enrollment management.
So we'll start it off with a poll, and get folks' thoughts of what is strategic enrollment management to them. So if you go ahead and vote on your screen, please. I'm guessing folks can see the. Yeah, we're starting to get some folks voting here. So, yeah, we've got about 3/4 of the folks who have voted already. We'll give it a couple more seconds. So, okay, very good. So let's go ahead and share the poll. I'm assuming that folks can see the poll. Jim, any surprises to you from what you're seeing here?
No, but first of all, Jerome, I think we probably shouldn't have jobs as designing test-taking questions. But no, people have, I'm not surprised. I was kind of wondering if people would sort of look at that alignment of enrollment, marketing, curriculum, which of course, even strategic enrollment management is more than that, but redesigning your enrollment process, depending how you interpret things, is not wrong either. But it's more about that sort of holistic, large scope thinking.
Okay, great. So what is strategic enrollment management?
So I look at this Bob Bontrager, who's passed away now, but great guy, gone before his time, but definitely a leader in this area. And the key things here are highlighted in blue. Strategic enrollment management is a concept and process that enables the fulfillment of institutional mission and students' educational goals. So trying to do, again, hand in hand, are you offering something? Is your mission enabling students' educational goals? So that concept and process of putting those things together, making sure that they aren't misaligned, and that you have a heads up on, are you trying to do things oftentimes we get, again, seduced by the tactics and things we want. All of us want to solve problems. A lot of us are engaged in that sort of, hey, there's a problem, let's fix it. We can get some innovative thoughts together. We can implement something. We can make things happen. So oftentimes we find out we're going really fast and we're doing it in a very efficient, process-driven manner, but we really need to stop, slow down, and start doing some of that foundational building work of, well, that's nice, you're going fast in some sort of direction, but where are you going? Are you going in the right direction? And that's where we need to determine, well, what is the direction? It's kind of like, well, we're just going to keep driving around until I eventually find something, and we're not going to actually stop and ask why we're going there, and even about asking if the directions are correct. So also I want to mention that strategic enrollment management, sometimes you may see relabeled now as things like student success management or some other variation of that. But regardless of the label, this is a worthy endeavor to make sure that your vision of who you are is aligned with the outcomes and the student's goals on the endpoint there. Because if you're not about that, then you're not going to have a purpose for existing. If you're an institution that does research also, if you don't pay attention to the students' educational goals, then you could just go be a think tank somewhere and do research only. So purpose of SEM are achieved by, again, looking at those clear goals, because you're going to be looking at, you want to do things, you have a clear reason for being. Again, you have that visionary touchstone, or when you have major changes occurring and initiatives that are considered, even when there aren't the correct people in the room, it's going to be part of that cultural change that does everyone at your institution, particularly people that are in the place of making decisions and making things happen, do they have that clear goal set, that mission, that vision out there that they can reach back to that touchstone and say, wait a second, is what we're doing here in support of what we're trying to achieve? And that helps realign people back to that institutional sense of direction. Students' academic success, improving access, transition, persistence, graduation, that's where we're kind of looking at, no, we're not just running things efficiently, like finding a really efficient way to get a whole bunch of names to mail to and email to, but are we being effective? So are the actions we're taking actually producing outcomes that we're trying to achieve? And are we actually measuring that those outcomes were achieved, which oftentimes becomes difficult when we're trying to do 10 or 12 different initiatives at the same time and sussing out which one actually has some sort of causation to the things we're trying to achieve, and not just some sort of random correlation that they existed around the same time that we saw a specific improvement. So promoting institutional success by enabling effective strategic and financial planning and creating a data-rich environment to inform our decisions and evaluate our strategies. That's also, I look at institutions, I'd say all of us have something akin, do we have something akin to big data, or do most of us kind of look around and say, I think we've got something that looks more like a big pile of data. So we may just have silos full of data. We have a very data-rich environment. So whether that's in your ERP system, your student information system, you also have a wealth of things out there, like every Wi-Fi access point, every point of sale system, if you have a campus, is everything tied together. But even if you don't have an expensive system to try to look at all this data, that may not be necessary, but what you do need are the people that can sit down and ask the right questions about that data, and then also be able to analyze it and understand the data they're looking at. So I alluded to this, and this poor little kid here with all the spaghetti on there, and I've spoken to just numerous institutions that do have that propensity to dive into multiple initiatives and just see what sticks against the wall. But even then, they're not sure if they've done those multiple things, something positive happened, but what was it that stuck against the wall? So it's not just throwing things against the wall to see what sticks. They're not even sure like which piece of spaghetti here was the one that actually worked. So a difficult time evaluating the merit and effectiveness of initiatives based on data. Before you do this, have you actually even established a baseline of where are you now? So where are you now? What are the things you're trying to increase? And then let's get that baseline. Now let's go forward and say, are these things you're doing, do you actually have any data and what's measurable? So what's really working? What was responsible for the positive increase? Or on the other side, if there's something negative happening, did something you change contribute to something in a negative manner? So can you actually demonstrate causal relationship on there? Or sometimes you only have an anecdotal correlation that you think is that. And I heard one person mention one time that anecdotes are actually small batch artisanal data. So you can think about them in that way. If somebody's saying, we need some data. And anecdotes and stories, I'd say, are powerful. So I wouldn't just kick those to the curb and just have everything based on data. But you have to have somebody who is able to take the data and also convert it into that compelling story that hits some of those emotional touch points.
Well, it sounds to me like it's both a combination of qualitative and quantitative research. Does that make sense?
It does, because you can just throw the numbers out there, but people can just look at a spreadsheet. Unless they're really astute and they're very familiar with what they're looking at and understand where it came from, it's always that story behind the data. Mm-hmm. People just ask, you throw that up there in some presentation with some VPs or provosts and president, board, and they're going to say, what am I looking at here? You better be able to explain that and say, here's the data and what we're looking at, and this is what it gets down to, and this is the understanding of it, and this is the story it's going to tell. Then also looking at evaluating some of that, how many initiatives, I was telling Drum, this kind of reminds me of how many taxes do we ever see get retired? And I think it was about, maybe I'm dating this a little bit, maybe it was 10 to 15 years ago, they finally retired the telephone tax that began in the Spanish-American War, the late 1800s. And that was still part of a tax to fund that back in the late 1800s. And they finally retired that. So how many times have you ever taken a look at evaluating initiatives that have occurred at your institution and actually retired, closed down, reimagined, or redefined something to be more effective?
This is one of the things that we talk about when we do change management is you're putting a lot of things on people's plates, so what are you taking off?
No, excellent point, John. And talking about taking that off of there, saw a presentation a long time ago that I thought had one of the best titles I've seen for a session. It was always, heroic effort is not a sustainable model. So, something's got to come off that plate. You can't just keep asking more and more of your people. You need to really, and the part of this is helping your people be more effective too, is making sure that they're directed in the appropriate way to achieve those goals you're trying to do. Because you've got great people, they want to do a good job, they want to be successful at what they're doing, but they want to be pointed in that direction that's going to allow them the most optimal place to achieve the purposes and achieve those goals you're setting out for them.
Well, it comes down to that study by American Quality Foundation and Ernst & Young. This for your first bullet point. Improving processes, organizational, financial efficiency, and outcomes. It's got to be focused around your customer.
Yeah, and those changes you're doing, improving those processes to make sure you're not doing it for change alone, just to try something different.
Mm-hmm.
but is it going to make you more or less effective in what you're trying to achieve? So sometimes even if somebody's looking at, I'm going to squeeze out the efficiencies, and you might have somebody coming at one thing from their only goal and task they have is, I'm going to go save some money on this. I'm going to make these processes very efficient and save some money here. But then is somebody actually watching that and saying, good job, you saved us $50,000 a year here. But overall, that same change reduced our institutional effectiveness and ended up costing us $250,000 out of another area. So you just kind of have to watch what you measure and what you incentivize. Those are going to be the behaviors that occur. So that's where alignment across all parts of the institution to achieve that overall goals and everything that either the president or the board or whoever you're kind of beholden to is actually trying to get to.
Exactly.
So communications and marketing with internal and external stakeholders, and of course identifying who are those, and knowing who those are. You can be really great at communication marketing, but are you communicating and marketing to the correct audiences? Increasing collaboration amongst departments across the campus. That's where I went to a Strategic Enrollment Management conference, was really, I thought, really great audience because it had everyone from presidents, provosts, enrollment management, sort of admissions, registrars, financial aid people, junior people within that director level, but also several faculty members. And one faculty member came in there and just said, I'm kind of skeptical about this, don't really get it. And then at the end of the conference came up to the same person she'd been talking to and just say, so what do you think? How was it? Did it meet what you're trying to do? And she's like, nah, not. She's like, it was essentially sort of life-changing for her in her perspective of the institution had been really around her department, what they're trying to do, and what they were trying to achieve with the academic side of the house and the provost. But then she was like, oh my gosh, I get it now. I need to go back and talk to my department head, and I get how we are woven into the entire fabric of that institution and the overall goals we're trying to achieve and how we can help on that enrollment and recruiting side of the house and trying to, educate people, create that value, and why they're going to want to be drawn to this institution.
That's part of the reason why good strategic planning is broad-based stakeholder input so that you can get that buy-in down the road and understand what's going on.
Right. So don't always take it on your shoulders. You've got allies you can either recruit or help show the light to across your organization, because you're all trying to, at the end of the day, achieve the same goals, or you should be, and that's where that needs to be from the top down and from the bottom up. People are really into knowing why they're there and why they're doing what they're doing. Yeah. So one thing, as I said, the collaboration across campus, Drum, is just people realizing it's that sort of cultural change to get in there, that you have to understand and trying to get something where people are all effectively ambassadors of the institution. So whether they're traveling somewhere, somebody ever has a question about it, everyone on campus, down to facilities, people, if you have physical space, that if somebody's walking by, do you have a campus tour program? Do they work with facilities to at least ensure things like the traditional campus tour pathway is safe? Are there any cracks in the sidewalks? Is it clean? Do they have a pride and place in the campus? And does everybody kind of buy into that? Say if you walk by and see a piece of trash on the ground of your place, do you walk by and pick it up? If you see a trash can that's like 15 feet in front of you, do you bend over and pick up that piece of trash no matter what your position is on campus and put it in there? Because you're always being watched, and you always have a chance when you're in a leadership position to start changing that culture when people say, oh my gosh, the president or that VP or that director just picked up a piece of trash and put it in there. So if there's a student watching you, if there's other staff, if there are people on a campus visit or a tour, prospective students, they see that people care, and there's a sense of pride and place in that institution, in that campus.
It reminds me of the leadership challenge. One of the key premises behind that is model the way, which is that very thing. You're an example as a leader. When I was in the Navy, we would have we were taught as officers, even if you were going to go to the base commissary or the department store, what we call the base exchange, you would still dress up in nice clothes. You wouldn't go there in jeans or cutoffs or anything like that, because you were always a leader in the eyes of people who were following you. And why would you do anything to discount that? You're just setting the example and you're modeling the way.
Yeah, and if you model the way, and the people are following that, that's where that change just cascades out and becomes bigger and greater, and you start affecting cultural change.
Exactly. Let's move on, if we may.
So, strategic planning framework. This pyramid I look at, you're building that foundation up. So, Drum, on some of your materials that you had out prior to the webinar, you had a great example of, this is like building a capital project. You're building a building. And without that strong foundation and all that work that kind of happens behind the scenes, it's kind of like the unsung heroes of what's happening, the great structures of the world are not going to remain standing very long if they don't have that solid foundation. So that institutional strategic plan, do you have a clarity of institutional mission, vision, goals? Do you understand what your core competencies are? Do you have a strategic direction? Do you have overall arching aggregate enrollment goals? Going up there, key enrollment indicators. Do you understand who your students are? Who are you trying to attract? Are they first-year freshmen? Are they transfers? Are they dual enrollment? Are they vocational, technical? Are they continuing ed? We've talked about this, Drum, face-to-face, online, certificates. You know, you have that depth and breadth of types of students. Who are you looking for? You're looking for people on academic, ability, certain socioeconomic backgrounds, first gen, racial, ethnic diversity, some combination. Do you understand who your students are? Are you national? Are you global? Are you more local or regional? Recruitment, retention, completion, your institutional capacity. So if somebody's got a plan for, we're just going to grow students, can you actually scale up? And are people taking into account within that plan, if the board comes in and just says, we need 1,000 more students. Well, how many of those students can we afford, even if we brought them? How many can just exist as variable costs before we get to a break point where we're going to have to start engendering more fixed costs to be able to serve them? And so if you're looking at that for just revenue generation, at what point may it not be effective? You really have to get into that budgetary and economic model also. Data collection analysis. Do you have those key enrollment indicators? Can you look back at data you've had for the last 3 or 5 years and assess that? Have you done a good an environment scan? Have you looked at the demographics and where they're going in the future? Economic situation of where your market is. What market opportunities exist for you? Have you actually reviewed your competition? Because you have to be keenly aware you're not the only player on the board out there. There are a lot of other higher ed, and then you have to kind of look at the socio-demographic things that are happening on large scale. Are people returning to education? Often that could happen in times of recession, or are they expanding out and the job market's really good so they can be pulled away and they're no longer looking for education because they've got jobs to go to. Enrollment goals, 5 to 10 years out, you're looking at those key enrollment indicators. Institution's desired future, do you have a focus? Where are you trying to get to? And are you basing it on your mission, vision, data, that environmental scanning we talked about? In your own enrollment infrastructure, do you have the staffing, skill sets, strategic deployment? Do you have systems in place? Policies, procedures? Do you have technology to deal with what you're trying to achieve? Do you have the capacity and the positions, reporting lines, committees set up to actually make those effective enrollment decisions? Because people have to look at that. They're going to have to make some decisions. Are you actually set up to do that in an effective way? And not just with 1 or 2 key people deciding everything. You need a good team out there you're going to be ready to listen to that's going to assess, look at, and help fill in some of your own blind spots. Then you get into the top of the pyramid here where you get the things where most of us are ready to go on. And too often I've seen a lot of people skip over everything down below there on that pyramid and dive into strategies and tactics. They're looking at increasing new students of specific types for strategies, or increasing retention rates, specifically by, again, what specific types of students? Can we utilize emerging technologies to change things? Can we really get into financial aid and scholarships and doing effective financial aid modeling and leveraging of financial aid to increase enrollment? But also you have to then get into, again, understanding who are the students you're trying to attract and get in there, because financial aid modeling and how you're going to utilize that and maximize that can change depending on what those goals are. Academic programs, are you getting into actually mixing and delivering systems of instruction and evaluating academic programs? Finally, get into tactics. So you're looking at marketing, branding initiatives. We'll talk about some of those later. Academic program review, multilingual recruitment materials. Are you targeting interventions for students in high-risk categories or courses? Enhanced academic advising. You could be purchasing a new CRM system, streamlining your admissions procedures. I mean, there's all sorts of things you can look at within that. Next slide, John. So again, it just gets down to the sustainable enrollment outcomes. Are you meeting your goals over the long term? I mean, you can cash in and you can tap into those endowments. You can tap into running that deficit for a short time to pump up some numbers, to meet some goals, but can you do that term after term, year after year? Or is there going to come a time to pay the piper if you don't have that consistent long-term set for how this is all going to get achieved? So campus-wide, looking there, revisions to the institutional strategic plan, is academic planning hand in hand with this, effects on facility planning, depending on where you're going to go or what sort of numbers you're trying to achieve, and also financial planning. So all of this, what budget model are you going to use, what kind of economic model. So trying to achieve that institution's desired future, all of this needs to come into play. And the key thing is just meeting these over the long term. You can do anything in a very short term, but you really need to have that solid foundation and vision and all the pieces in place to reach higher and stand on the shoulders of all that's been built up before that. So this one, I just look at, again, a sense of direction. Drum mentioned he was an officer in the Navy. I was a graduate of the Coast Guard Academy, so coincidentally, we both have a background as officers in a seagoing service. So I think this navigational and sense of direction stuff it lives in there for a long time. But this is where I'm looking at fundamental lasting change. You know, for better or for worse, can be difficult to observe because it often happens as a cumulative set of small incremental changes that compound over time to create a larger, more visible results. So if you're looking at something like a compass, if you make a small change of direction by even a single degree, that becomes amplified over time and distance from where that course change took place. So it's sort of like compounding interest. If you start saving for retirement earlier, you're going to compound that interest and you're going to end up with a lot more if you just started 5 years earlier, 10 years earlier. So recognizing what you need to do and taking the time to do that now instead of 3 years from now, you can be in a different place, and you can be, with that small set of changes, you can end up in a different location in a much more desirable future. So you have a chance to affect those changes that are going to create a different future. But you need the earlier you start, the more effective and the better place you're going to reach. So organizational alignment, again, you don't have to tell everybody, we're going to go exactly east, and everybody's going to go lockstep. I'm not saying it's going to be easy to get your entire institution organization going in the same direction at the same time. I know how challenging that is, but it's not like you have to define that just everybody's going to head east, this is exactly where we're going, but you do have to pick a quadrant. So at least say everyone's going to head northeast, and you've got some flexibility, so we're not cutting off innovation, initiative, but we're all sort of heading in that general northeast direction. So we're not pulling directly against each other. We've got several initiatives, I think, on every campus where some things are diametrically opposed. Some people are doing this, other people are pulling in the opposite directions. At least you need to have that same sense of kind of general direction things are moving. Because there's usually a lot of pent-up energy. People want to do good things, they want to progress, they want to be part of something that is successful with still some latitude to innovate and help move things forward so they're not always in lockstep. So 3 characteristics of sustainable higher ed institutions: holistic thinking. People think about the big picture. Leadership, at least, is looking at that big picture. Ongoing strategic planning. And again, not changing your strategic plan at the drop of a hat like every other week, kind of a flavor of the month type of thing, but reassessing it and saying, is this still applicable? Has something in the environment changed? Are we still on the right path? In some way to measure those outcomes, not just the processes that are occurring, but are we achieving those outcomes? Are we graduating people that are successful, that can serve as living marketing testimonials to why someone wants to come here to our place? Alignment, the institution strategy, structures, processes, to be the most effective possible, they have to align. Everything has to be, again, moving in that same general direction. You can have very mediocre things continue for a very surprising long amount of time, and something is gradually eroding away. Again, it can kind of be like you're just turning up the heat and boiling the water, and that crab or that lobster is not even going to know what's happening until it's too late. So always look at aligning, keeping things moving in the same direction. Stakeholder attunement. Pull people in. You've got a lot of smart folks. They're going to want to say in things. You're still going to have to make that endpoint decision. But again, you don't want to be blindsided by spots out there you just can't visualize or see. And you want to make sure that you have that necessary information in there. And I know you're going to have to make a decision before you have the perfect information. Otherwise, you're going to end up in sort of that analysis paralysis. But leadership's crucial for everything. It shapes the culture, as I said, through that demonstrated behavior, that pride in institution, that people can sense that you have a sense of ownership and stewardship, that people care. And of course, culture can always, the old saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast and pretty much any other meal it's up against. But don't hesitate to lead that positive change in the culture if you need to do that. I will always look at, if I have a staff member, to give them the latitude of picking our overall mission before our very small processes. So if someone's, for example, if someone's 5 or 10 minutes late to a meeting, and they were late because they stopped to help somebody on our campus who looked lost, or some visitors who were trying to figure out where they were going, I will tell them to please be late 5 to 10 minutes to that meeting, because that's more important. Because for us, if you're looking at purely from a monetary perspective, if that was an out-of-state, non-resident person and that made or break their experience, if that was the straw that could have broken the camel's back and there's 1,000 of them out there, then that person's 5 or 10 minutes of time helped somebody make that decision. I can't think of anything more worthwhile they could have done with their time. So again, never forget that you're all ambassadors of the institution on, off a campus, and you always have a chance to help sway somebody or change their mind or show them and demonstrate why you have a quality caring institution, particularly if you have a residential institution and you're going to move into a world of online and different methods of conveying instruction. You're going to have to really show why somebody might want to come to your specific place and what's different about that place and why they want to be a part of it. On this, this is a great slide, kind of looking ahead. What are those challenges in front of you? Where do you have to take your team? Where do you have to lead people? I was looking at my own sense of this management. I was looking at the difference between what's management and what's leadership. One of my general things I look at is management. I think about sometimes as helping you guide your team most effectively through what the known is. So dealing with what's known, making efficient processes, practices, policies, getting things done well. It's really about good customer service, and it's very important. If I look at leadership, and that's what's needed to effectively guide your team into the unknown, the yet to be defined future that you have a chance to shape. Not just doing the same old things over year, expecting those different results, and the world and the environment around us changes. And again, don't forget that we're competing against others, and sometimes to do that, or if you find yourself in that situation where you're one of the schools or an institution that is tapping into running a deficit, that's not working. You're going to have to go and lead people into some unknown situation, something you haven't tried yet. And sometimes you have to look at that and say, we need to look at some of those things, almost have a leadership team meeting, say, even if we're in a good place right now, let's pretend that next year, all of a sudden we have a dive in enrollment. And even the next year we start having that again. What are things we would consider doing or changing to make ourselves even more effective that would turn something like that around? Because if you're looking at doing some things or doing some great different new initiatives, why not think about them now before you're in that place where you're in crisis and you're forced to take those actions? Then you have a more leisurely way to take it, to evaluate those, assess them, and see if they're the necessary changes you're going to need for the future.
Yeah. Jim, let's talk a little bit about some of the global enrollment pressures
Sure.
that you've been seeing.
Yeah, I'm saying next slide really quick is just something I just talked about. One of the things in leadership is before you find yourselves here, sort of the end of the trail on the edge of a precipice, part of leadership is assessing that, working with that team to look out, farther out, so you have a chance to change direction for your institution, your people, so you never are placed at this position. You make that course correction farther back, so you never end up at the edge of this precipice. You maybe head over that next pass to get to that great valley on the other side. So you're on the edge of your choice of directions become very limited when you're at this point, and you may have crossed that critical inflection point, and you may have reached a point of no return. You can't turn back here. So you need to keep your head up, eyes open. So, Joe, let's look at demographics real quick. This is the U.S. public-private high school graduates. So you're looking at this data from 2016, WICHE data, Western Interstate Commission for Higher Ed. And this we're looking at just overall high school graduates, kind of that first-time, full-time freshman group. And you can see this data where it's kind of peaking up and you're hitting this kind of flat part and it kind of decreases. You're seeing some of the changes in some of the ethnic demographic populations. And I'm just going to mention really quickly that worldwide, things are even changing more radically. Had a great session. A gentleman named Francisco Marmolejo works for the World Bank Group, does tertiary education, global education. And you look at, if you're a school that's depending on some international enrollment, we've seen some of the kind of chilling effects, some of the recent administration takes on immigration have wrought on some of those, even if they aren't specifically countries we're interested in. People may have chosen to go to Canada or some others, so we're seeing some of that dip down. But what Francisco mentioned that is just incredible. If you're looking for places like China and India, realize the U.S. is a sought-after place to come, but there are also other countries and nations that are ramping up their higher education. India, for instance, over the last 10 years, has opened up 6.3 new institutions every day, and that's including weekends. That's amazing. But you think about the size of that population. They now have about 42,000 higher ed institutions in India of some breadth or another of type of institution. We have about 14% of the higher ed educated individuals living globally in the U.S. projected by 2030 to be down to about 8%. And that could change a little bit depending on if folks are immigrating with higher ed educations or not. And you're going to end up with Africa up to 40% of the youth worldwide by 2030. So there's huge demographic population changes happening around the world, which will have a gigantic effects on the international part, while we're also looking at our own holding steady or decreasing in some areas on our national U.S. front. Next slide. So in light of, I mentioned this earlier, diminishing government support for higher ed. You can get into, after Drum uploads this, into some of the numbers if you want to take a look at this. But again, that's that move from state-funded, state-supported, state-located, as state funding for higher education goes down, and you're asking families and individuals through loans and financial aid to bear more of that brunt. If they come to you, they really want you, but the price points become unachievable. How are you able to demonstrate that commensurate value that they may get from you? And are you worth it? So that's really off-putting a lot. We see that happen with us. People really want to come here, but especially non-resident tuition, it's just becomes kind of the untenable point. You're reaching sort of a break point. All right, international enrollments. I mentioned some of this, but this is some of the AACRAO research. We polled institutions to gauge climate across countries, and we're seeing a lot of our Canadian members have experienced quite a jump in enrollment activity and applications. Obviously, Middle East applications were hit hardest. So we have a lot of Saudi students, and even those that are funded by some of the other institutions in Saudi Arabia, even some of that is starting to back off. China, again, they are also ramping up their own institutions. So I know even community colleges, for instance, in California, that have been bringing in Chinese students and people looking to kind of get a leg up, would always be in that tug between, is your mission as a community college in the state of California to help educate students in California, but they'd look at it and say, well, we're not getting funded very much, so we're trying to bring in more international students that are basically paying full pay and helping us fund it so we can go educate the students at the state. Okay, so national, rising cost of education, touched on that a little bit. Insurance, maintenance contracts are largely outside the control of our institutions. So you're looking at retirement systems, types of things, trying to pay those off. Health insurance, increasing, all contribute to the rise. And if you're publicly funded, the increasing divestment in that type of education having been made up on the other side on students and families. Competition for facilities, requiring investments in campus infrastructure and personnel, particularly residential, if you're trying to demonstrate, again, are you competing on facilities that are available? So everybody's heard, stories about, somebody has a lazy river or a rock wall or something like that. But again, how much are students really placing on, is that the kind of place where I want to come based on they had an awesome swimming pool? Or is it more about what's the experience? And can you convey the story of that experience you're going to have and why, who the students are that you're looking for, and what's the story of that experience that you're going to have on this campus that's going to differentiate you from all the people that you're competing with? Technology, multi-million-dollar issue, virtually every campus, and it's high expectations, and that's what's really there. I mentioned expectations can be resentments and waiting. You always have to align the message with the experience of your campus. So whatever your recruiting materials are, really need to match what reality is when students get to you. You don't want them experiencing any kind of cognitive dissonance on what their expected experience was and what their true experience is. That's going to just lead to retention numbers that are going to start dropping rapidly.
Yeah, and we've got a slide later on that talks about expectations of students coming in versus what they really want after they've been there a year or 2 years, which I think we'll find really interesting.
Yeah, when I say technology and expectations are high, you can stay on the slide. Everybody's got Facebooks, Googles, Amazons of the world, Netflix, etc. So they come to us and they kind of expect, like, oh my gosh. Sometimes they'll say, my high school had better stuff than what we've got going on here. And it's kind of you have to select what you're going to spend funds on and or make some deals or start using Google Mail. You can't start creating your own stuff. It just gets too expensive. But you do have to realize those expectations of what everybody's using out there in the rest of the world, they're going to expect those things when they get to you. Mention performance-based funding and how your outcomes models or how you're getting either graded by possibly a state agency or your own board, what they're looking for, what are the numbers, graduation rates, revenue, et cetera, they're trying to reach. Popular perceptions out there, again, that a degree is not worth the cost. While not true, that's been out there in press, media, and higher education. Well, we can actually look at hardcore numbers, and one of our guys on our research team put together a great financial aid sort of model and looking at high school only, associate's degrees, 4-year, et cetera, and just modeling out what the differences are. And you've seen a lot of these studies, what the differences are in lifetime earnings and how that really does pay off. And that's a lot of things you have to be kind of cognizant, too, of when the financial aid piece gets out there. We'll look at our average graduates. I think the average across the nation, when they say financial aid debt's around $32,000, I think ours is $26,000. But what doesn't get painted out there in the media is those are students with financial aid debt. And for our institution, what doesn't get painted in that picture is 50% of our graduates have no debt. They're only looking at the 50% with debt and what that average is. So it's always kind of something, for me, it's kind of a personal thing. It always gets lost sort of in that media story that's out there. Everybody immediately thinks every single student that's ever graduated, that's the debt they have, which isn't an actual correct picture. And they always want to go with the outliers, the crazy people that somehow engendered $250,000 in debt. Pew study, let's point this out just because the political climate right now, 58% of Republicans think American education is actually bad for America. And that's probably more of the, are people changing their minds, or is there a kind of liberal education, and not in terms of liberal and conservative, but the actual liberal arts. But usually that gets put out there. A lot of politicians, and I always kind of look at any of the politicians we're working with, and I just got back from a visit in D.C. last week, visiting some Senate and House offices. But you always have to ask the politicians, hey, do you have any kids? Are they going to college somewhere? And they're like, well, yes, they are. And they're often very exclusive colleges. So it's kind of, if you want to kind of put higher ed down, you can't at the same time, at the other side of your mouth, send your own kids there. First generational families don't understand the portability of the skills between earned degree and the career paths of graduates. We have huge opportunities out there for vocational, technical training and specific things, and that's where you have to look at, are those flexible? And then for sort of a liberal arts education area, people understand the sort of the flexibility and how you can adapt that to different paths. And there's several companies out there working on helping students tell their story and understanding how to make themselves seen as being, how they can connote or convey that value to employers. All right, next slide. So scalability, retention, graduation programs. Again, with the spaghetti thrown against the wall, there's experiments you're doing with student transition success programs. Even if you get something that's really good, can you scale that out? Or is it only a pilot model type of thing, where you find out it actually takes so many staff resources that it's become very boutique kind of concierge model that you really can't expand to thousands of students? That's kind of the main thing there. One thing I wanted to mention was one that University of Iowa had done, and this is again looking at that sort of big data piece. And they got into this. I just think it's very interesting. You usually have those three accepted pillars of retention when people look at social, academic, and financial. And if all of those are there, you have a pretty good shot at retaining somebody. If one of those legs on the three-legged stool is endangered, that stool will fall over, and that person won't be retained. So University of Iowa did something where they looked at all their point-of-sale systems and all their dining halls, and it's particularly first-year students and looking at first-year retention. And they started looking at, they could see that Drum went through the line, and then I went through right behind him, or I was at a point-of-sale system very close to him, and you could start to see people at the same time that would indicate that they were dining together. And then you started looking at people who had no correlation to anybody else ever at the same time, and that they're frequently just eating alone. So the social aspect was endangered, and without approaching them kind of in a creepy way, like we've been watching when you eat and all that kind of stuff, but sort of just finding a different way to approach a student and do that, they had an increase, and they're attributing to just that thing by itself and like a 3 to 4% retention increase, which is amazing. And I just like people to think out of the box and really try to look at, you have the data, how can you use it in a positive way? Responses to pressures, looking at increased tuition discounting. Now, this gets a pretty tricky area, and I just looked at some data. I believe Noel Levitz, I think, just had something released either yesterday or the day before on looking at some tuition discounting in public and privates. And increased tuition discounting was, I think, gone up to like 3%. Now, that's a tricky thing you get into, because you look at some privates in particular have gotten some in trouble by discounting 50% in that area. And I think, Drum, that's probably part of what you mentioned is eating into or running at a deficit, because you're trying to discount that sticker price for what kind of aid and help you're going to get them to what the actual cost is going to be that they're going to deliver to the institution. Marketing in new geographic areas, higher risk, because who else is already in that geographic area? It might look promising, like you'll look at demographic trends and high school graduates in the state of Texas is growing. So everyone and their brother and sister and cousins are going to go to Texas and start trying to recruit Texas. But who's been there before you? Who's been working that already? And how many resources you're going to have to put in there as far as, do you need a regional counselor there? How do you get a toehold in there, et cetera? You know all the issues that are going to involve with that. Proliferation of degree programs without corresponding program review initiatives. And again, this is some of the spaghetti on the wall, but these are specific degree programs. And again, are you getting in on the leading edge, the bleeding edge of something happening, hopefully not the bleeding edge, but the leading edge of something happening, or is this an area that's been saturated and you're really coming in kind of late to the game and kind of realizing this is actually probably on the downside, or it's so saturated that it's really not worth building out that new degree program, unless you can really prove why you can distinctively do it in a different way that will attract students. Technology solutions with strategic plan or implementation or knowledge of how they fit into strategies. So this is, again, the shiny thing. Somebody goes to a conference somewhere, sees something like, oh my gosh, if we just buy that thing and put it there, it's going to change the world and everything's going to be great. But again, even those things, every little microcosm has its own sort of pyramidal foundational things that have to be built out, and making something effective rather than just having it exist as possibly shelfware or not implemented correctly. A lot of danger and high risk in that area too. Do you have any others, Drum? Or
no, I think you've covered the majority of them.
Okay, the next slide, clear value proposition. So retention, number one, it's like every company out there. It's usually easier and much more valuable to retain the customer, the client, the student you have, than it is to go out there and recruit and get the new one in. And this particularly becomes more relevant right now as our demographics shrink in particular areas and localities with future high school graduates that are available to enroll. The retention of the current students you already have becomes even that much more important. That value of that retained student is increasing, and you really need to recognize that. Retention doesn't just become a buzzword or that's somebody else's responsibility. Even the recruiting admissions piece of that needs to recognize that too and do what they can to make sure that they're setting somebody up for success. Statements on costs that are clear and easy to understand. It's just not obscure, common cost, not financial aid. It's what is it actually going to take you? It's sort of that total cost of ownership. And that link statement about what you're engendering here is an investment in your future. And if you can really link it out there to information on how to pay those costs, especially for first generation students and people who haven't been through this, and even people who have been there, but it's been a long time, how can they make this happen? Why is this an investment in yourself and your future? How you can deliver that, particularly if you can link that to how you can deliver that to employment, your recent graduates. And recent graduates are the best. I know it's hard to really get information on them sometimes, but where can you go? Where have you shown a record of success? And you really have to do a better job of painting that entire value chain. And then that's going to be something that feeds on itself. Is once you have those people, those students are successful alums, and I'll look at the student life cycle here in a little bit, but that's going to show that that's probably the best alum you can have. It's the one that's satisfied with what you've been able to do for them. Competitive advantages, what that gives them, and advantages they may have over others, but also competitive advantages for your institution. Next slide, John. Outcomes focus on what graduates are doing with their degrees. Again, that's recent graduates. Can you show what they're doing? Even people that can't visualize what you might do with a certain degree, if somebody comes to you for history or something else like that, there are so many different jobs that people might think, I've got a history degree, the only thing I can do is go teach history. But there are just such a variation of different types of jobs where that type of thing can be implied. You need to sort of open people's eyes and to the horizon of all kinds of different possibilities and how those degrees can be utilized. Okay, competitive advantages. Have you really sat down to assess your institution's strength, particularly against your main competitors? And the other side of that is say, do you think you have a good feeling of, do you know who your competitors are? And that's part of the environmental scan. Do you really know who they are? perhaps something more comprehensive on the global stage, the demand for talent is going to skyrocket. Economies are going to be seeking people's skills, the skills people want with integrity, reliability, flexibility, empathy, a lot of other sort of non-technical kind of things. Can you focus on not just what you're going to deliver to that student as far as the academic piece, but how are you getting all those other qualities and demonstrating those or marketing those to students that you can help deliver those other pieces that employers are looking for that aren't just the academic pieces. So how do you make yourself more unique in actually competing in that competitive landscape? And when I say, do you know who your competitors are, sometimes I don't know if anybody's used National Student Clearinghouse and student tracker capabilities on there to look at where your applicants have gone if they haven't come to you. It can be very enlightening sometimes to look at that and say, whoa, I wouldn't even have thought as that school as one of our competitors. So it's really, really eye-opening and enlightening to see who your students or potential students didn't come to you, where are they going? Do you really know what your competitive landscape is? So you really need, and I said part of that differentiation on things that are aligned with student choice factors are colleges and universities, schools of all kinds going beyond sort of the traditional curriculum and helping students develop their personas. That whole package that employers on the other side are looking for. And again, that gets back to everything else that leads up to that value chain, that leads up to students attaining their educational goals, that aligns back with our vision and our mission. Okay. I just mentioned that previous one on major competitors for applicants and middle students and factors. So we're looking at factors. Oh, John, you can go to that next one, sorry. So any surprises you found there? And factors, it really gets back to students, and this is, again, that return on investment, that value, what they're looking for. Students, again and again, when we survey them, or you get the survey of college freshmen, or this one done by Cheggs and StatMats, Teens Talk, always comes to the top is going to be what's offered, what's your major, what's your program. Because if you don't have that, I mean, students can always say, I love sports, I like going there, it's got a great party scene or something like that, or they've got a great pool, or there's the great feel, I love how the campus looks. Those can all be factors that are going to sway people that are in the middle ground that have the ability to move back and forth, haven't made the decision yet. But if you just simply don't have the major or the program, somebody's looking for nuclear engineering, and you don't have that, and they're just set on that, there's pretty much nothing you're going to do to convince them otherwise. Some of these are really interesting to look at, and after Drum uploads them, I'd say go back and take a look at this. Some are kind of eye-opening to what isn't thought about as much prior to them being a high school senior, high school junior, and then when they're actually a student on the campus, what things go up, what things go down. You can kind of see like people get homesick a little bit, maybe wanted to be closer to home after they've gotten there. Is the major is important. The feel of being on campus was good in a recruiting sense, but not so much once they're actually on campus and living there. They're probably just like, oh, I'm just doing my routine thing, and it's not, I just see the same thing every day, so it's not as important. All right, student life cycle. And this one I look at, I just want to point, this is kind of what we look at, Roger Thompson, our VP for our Student Services Enrollment Management area, the typical sort of prospect, admitted, enrolled, graduate, alum, donor. And when we look at donor, we really look at this as being anything from word of mouth, that goodwill, that what do they say in a supermarket about you? What does somebody say when they are traveling off at somewhere else they live and somebody in that local area asks them, hey, did you like your experience there? I'm thinking about going there. It's also time. Are they willing to donate time? Are they willing to donate money? But it's really the ultimate measure of a satisfied alum is, are they willing to be a donor in some way or another? That they're out there being that living advocate, that they are now that ambassador for you, and they're not giving you like discouraging bad word of mouth out there. So Einstein here, I'm doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. So what are we doing? Oftentimes I kind of look at admissions sometimes to say, what value are we lending? In all the recruiting, admissions, marketing, and things like that. What if you just stopped that and turned it off? Not saying you should go do that, but it's almost like an A/B sort of experiment. and we don't have a spot we can really do that in totality, is what if you didn't do any of that? How many people would still kind of show up and came because they know those alums, because you have a reputation, and people know who you are, And not all of us are going to be the sort of Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Stanfords out there. That people know that name globally, and will probably just show up. They wouldn't have to do any kind of marketing, recruiting, et cetera, unless they're just competing with each other for that very kind of razor thin edge of super high ability students.
What I'm hearing here is the strategic enrollment management process is frankly not all that unsimilar to strategic planning. In fact, they should go hand in glove, but there's so many different areas that people need to be looking at and probably aren't, that's why they're making so many mistakes and their enrollment isn't where it is. Does that make sense, Jim?
It does, and people, I think, sometimes just make that assumption that we're just going to do these same things. We're just going to go by these names, but they sort of make those just not incremental changes in a good way, but the same things, but with small tweaks. It's kind of like, well, everything sort of worked, and we sort of have made our class, and I know people really don't want to endanger, like, we've done this in the past, it's kind of made our class, and we don't want to tweak it too much because we could endanger that class coming in, and everything rides on that, and people think there's this magical ability, once in a while you get lucky, you get within, like, 5 students from who you really wanted to get there in the door. But are they just making it, again, those incremental tweaks and like, okay, we're going to do our name by, we're going to kind of get in there and going to tweak this up a little bit. And it's a difficult thing to sit there and assess and look at, should we keep doing that? But in addition, we should think about kind of a whole new other way to do it, because that heat can get turned up very slowly. So especially if you're in that position where you are deficit spending or you are tapping an endowment, you need to really start thinking about something different than what you've just been doing and making very small tweaks to your current process. You need to back up a bit and look at who are students, what's our reason for being, and are we really delivering that? Are we looking at those? Do we have that whole pyramid kind of built up there? At least assess that and see where you need to kind of make some changes, stick some things in, and divert from what you've currently done all the time to really looking at some kind of program initiative or something outside of that. And let's get some innovative thinkers in there to really change that while you still have time to make some corrections.
It seems to boil down to, what is your mission? And that's the fundamental thing, is what is your mission for your institution? Who is the right student to be there, and how do you reach them? I know that's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but it seems I have a simple mind, and I like to boil things down to things that I can understand.
No, I like that, Drum, and that's what I've always kind of gone after is, again, can you understand, if you know who you are, you know who that student should be, and how are you going to reach them? Because we all have those stealth applicants, those stealth students that aren't in a CRM system, that aren't anywhere else, they weren't on a tour, they weren't in one of our name buys, and boom, they show up and apply. Mm-hmm. So how did we miss them? Where did they come from? And particularly if they apply, and you can kind of go back all the way up the line to who are the self-applicants. Not only did they apply, you accepted them, you admitted them, they began here, and they were successful as a student here. Mm-hmm. So how did we fail in some way to recognize who that person was, and why weren't we out there earlier communicating with them?
Yeah. So we've got about 10 minutes left.
Go ahead.
Got a lot of things here. We just talked about, really, what do we do? Who do we say we are? What are we promising with the brand? How are we messaging it? What are the tactics? And who are the people that we have on board that we need to be able to execute these strategies? So just a couple of things on brand promise and positioning. We have a quick poll here, and the poll really is, which of these following best describes your institution? We can get a people to vote. Seeing a few votes coming in here. And I'll go ahead and close off the poll. This does not surprise me at all. You know, most folks, they have a plan with no brand strategy, or they have a brand strategy separate from planning. It's not really done together, which is one of those things that we think is really critical as part of the strategic planning process, is to do your brand strategy. So thank you for your participation, folks. Let's see here. See if we can get going. So this is the process that we talk about when doing planning, and you can see it begins really with what your future state is and what's your brand promise. And as Jim talked about, there's a lot of data, a lot of input that needs to go into how do you communicate. What is the brand promise? What is your mission? And then looking at the environment that you're operating in, and then going to your mission, values, positioning, and all the way through. One of the big things that we see folks do is they'll go from the plan directly over to implement. They'll skip brand promise. They'll skip all these things. They'll do it outside of it. So they have this is where we want to go. Here are our strategies, which may or may not take into account the environment. And then they'll go right. They won't even do an implementation plan. They'll go just straight into implementing. And all these things, people ask, why is my strategic plan not effective? It's because they've missed all of these things. So defining the brand promise. Jim, you want to talk about these quickly?
We've gone through some of those. And again, understanding, it's not just a mission statement that everybody throws in a giant word hopper and it just comes out and spits out. It's got to be something, again, that is that touchstone type of thing people reach back to when they're in times of crisis, times of decision making, thinking about change. You can reach back and say, are we doing the right thing? Are we going the right direction? You need to have those distinctive competencies and those differentiators about what's unique about your institution. Are there specific programs you've got that set you apart? Or do you do standard programs really well? You've got some fantastic faculty. Understanding, again, who your customer is. Who's that student? Is it the first-time freshman? Is it adult learners? Are people in a hybrid situation of campus and online or strictly online? Who do they think you are? So who do you think your customer is, and who do they say you are? Who do they think you are? Does that line up with how you see yourself? Why do students come to your institution? Again, those are those driving, just understanding that you may think you know, but have you asked them? And do you have some good quantitative or qualitative data on why they come there? Why do faculty want to be a part of your institution? Is it just a job, or do you, again, produce something for them, or unique sort of student experience, or why do they want to be a part of you?
Some of the most effective institutions I've seen do student surveys at the end of each year. When a student first comes, and they start the baseline as a student is, accepted or rejected, or they were accepted and didn't come to your institution, and finding out why they didn't. You can make changes along those lines. Again, data-driven decisions, which are always critical. With your brand, there's nowhere to hide. If you take a look at something like Starbucks, Starbucks is probably one of, if not the most recognized brand, with Apple. And you clearly know with Apple, you clearly know with Starbucks what you're getting. Does your institution, do your students know exactly what they're getting? I would bet, and Jim, probably you've seen this a lot more than I have, is most institutions, students come there for one or two reasons, but is that brand promise really there?
That's what I said. You can't allow the cognitive dissonance from your marketing, recruiting, branding to not be met and aligned with what the reality is the person's going to experience. Because once that's shattered, it's like, ugh. I mean, you feel taken, you feel kind of abused inside that this is not what I expected. This is not, the consistency was lost in between those two places.
Exactly. And it really depends on the type of student you're going after as far as how you position yourself and your marketing messaging. You know, if you're going after non-traditional students who are baby boomers or Gen X online programs, your messaging is going to be far different than it will be for millennials who are coming on campus. I mean, you have to understand what students. You can't throw spaghetti up against a wall and expect it to stick, and then you don't have any idea of how your whole marketing, how your enrollment campaigns are going. It needs to be very deliberate and measured the whole way through.
Yeah, it's going to be different on channel and different on audience.
Exactly. And when the slides are uploaded, what I would suggest for folks to do is take a look at the various examples that we have used up here. There's a clear purpose on how the brand is messaged. And for instance, uses very simple messages that sound like people talk. You know, American University, what kind of job you'll get. So you can see some really good examples. All of these things are your marketing tactics, but they're reflected from the process that you do with your strategic enrollment management. And really even more basic than that, what is your mission and what are the students that you're attempting to attract? So in wrapping it up, Jim?
Like I said, know where you're going. Strategic planning. So just these kind of questions, I think. Know where you're going, who you are, what you're promising, that brand. Have you ever arrived there? Are you doing something to measure your progress? Do you want to, who are you going to be when you grow up? So it's kind of like, we've got these aspirations, we're going to do these things, but how do you know you've gotten there? How do you know you've arrived? Or how do you know you're at least moving towards that place? Are you measuring anything? Who your stakeholders and customers are? Involve them in the process. So who is the audience? Who are the students you're trying to get? Who are you catering to? Or who do you want to become? And do you want to cater to a different audience? So who are they? Who are the stakeholders? Who are the students, current and in the future? And really understanding them so you can recruit them, support them, and help them meet their goals. Mm-hmm. So I look at, one thing always, we're always on a hamster wheel, I think. There's no downtime anymore. There's no summers off and life is easy. Even when you reach the top, I'm just saying, you always take time to look back, en route, going through a high pass, you've reached your destination. Don't forget to take time to look back, see how far you've come. Don't forget to celebrate with your team before you turn to that next challenge that lies ahead of you. Because too often, I tend to do this, continue to forge ahead without really acknowledging the achievements it's taken and the team that's helped enable you to get there, and the work and the sacrifice it's taken you and it's taken them to help attain those goals. You need to appreciate those people because they're going to be the ones that are helping you get to that next goal you're going to have out there.
So, well, great, Jim. Thank you. Thank you very much. We are pretty much at the end of the time. If there's any questions, I haven't seen anything typed into the questions box. If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out. And for those of you who did stay, thank you so much for coming. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. So thank you again, Jim. We greatly appreciate it.